On this episode of Booked on Rock, Grammy-winning and Juno Award-winning producer and composer Fred Mollin. He shares his incredible stories of working with Billy Joel, Michael McDonald, and a whole lot more, plus his work on composing music for films, including the Friday the 13th series. That's next.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Hey guys, welcome back to Booked on Rock. Great to have you back. I'm Eric Senich, this episode's guest. Grammy-nominated, Juno Award-winning producer and composer Fred Mollin. He is the author of the new book Unplugged, Stories and Secrets from a Life of Making Records, Scoring Film, and Working with the Legends of Music. Fred, thanks so much for being on the show.
I'm honored. Thank you. You
have so many stories to tell. And I did watch, there was a video of yours where you said you got to get this all into a book before you forget it all.
You know, the hard drive is full up here, so you don't want to lose anything.
Your introduction starts with, quote, "If you had told me in my teenage years that I would have the opportunities that I've had, especially to work with some of the world's greatest musical legends, I would have been the most self-assured and confident Long Island dreamer there ever was. The fact that I got to record with so many artists I admire, as well as work with some of my deepest inspirations and heroes, was beyond my imagination." Before we get to all those amazing opportunities, you grew up not too far from where I am here. I'm in Connecticut. You grew up in Long Island. And in fact, your neighbor was Jerry Greenfield of Ben & Jerry's ice cream fame.
Yeah, it's so funny. When you think about it, how goofy is even early in my life, as a young child into my teens, when I left home at 16, my neighbors were the Greenfields, of course, and Jerry became Jerry of Ben & Jerry.
What a story. So tell us about your early life. And also, I'm curious, what was that first moment when you realized, I want to make a living in the music business?
Well, first of all, I grew up in Merrick, Long Island, which is about 45 minutes away from Manhattan. A really beautiful little Leave It to Beaver type suburb. I had a wonderful life. Not a lot of angst, really. And, the truth is that when the Beatles hit at 11, I was 11 years old. Yeah, in 1964, I was 11. So that's when I really was hit by lightning, like so many others. Literally, there are millions whose life changed. And my life changed. All of a sudden, I know it sounds sort of like a caricature, but all of a sudden I wanted a really nice guitar. I wanted to write my own songs and sing them and shake my head. And I wanted to have girls. And it was like, bang, so all of a sudden I had literally a roadmap of what I wanted. And then I sort of went at it. And by the time I was 16, in my first year of high school, I was so dedicated to trying to have a life in music, especially at that point as a singer-songwriter, sort of like a James Taylor or someone that I was really admiring at that time. I just wanted to get out of school and start. And so I quit school on my birthday at age 16.
It is amazing. Was it February 9th, 1964? That was the Ed Sullivan.
Yes.
It's amazing how many people in the business like yourself, musicians, producers, engineers, you name it. That one night, it was, 72 million people watching.
It changed the world.
Yeah. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
That's why I say they're the most important band in rock and roll.
You won't get any argument from
right?
me.
It's just amazing. So you're working hard in New York, trying to break into the business as a musician, but it was in Canada where your career and your life changed. So tell us how you end up in Canada, and also talk about how that would lead to your first producer gig with Dan Hill.
Well, I struggled. I didn't know anybody in the world of show business. My family is not a show business family, or it wasn't at that point. And so when I quit school, I was knocking on a lot of doors in New York and couldn't get through them. My brother, who had become my best friend, especially after he went to university, he became very creative. And so my brother and I started writing songs together, and he was really he's 7 years older than me, so he was really my best friend, but he was also someone that I had to use on a lot of levels as the person to take care of me, because we were on our own from age 16 on. And so about a year and a half later, he moved to Toronto, he and his gal. He wanted to become an underground theater actor, and there was a huge scene there in Toronto. And so in 72, I joined him there to check it out. And really, I never left. It was all of a sudden, all the things I was trying for in New York, I got. I got a record deal, I had college gigs, And I loved Toronto. It was totally an exciting, wide open city. And I just started my career there. And so for the first number of years, I guess 72, 73, I really was playing gigs all over and really trying to have a life as a singer-songwriter, trying to get a record deal myself. And then to try to make this story a little shorter, Dan Hill, who I was playing gigs alongside of in the same clubs, needed a demo produced, and he asked me out of nowhere if I would produce a demo for him. And Dan was really a talented guy. He was writing great, very emotional songs, and the girls loved him, and we became great friends. And so when he asked me, I said, of course, I'd love to produce your demo, meaning, of course, I've never produced anything in my life, but it sounded exciting to me. And I knew a lot about what a record producer did, which was basically a director and oversaw every part of the recording. But it was just a guitar and vocal demo. However, I felt very powerful as a producer of that little demo. And interestingly enough, the story was that I got to the studio in Toronto to be the big producer of this little acoustic demo of Dan's. And there was a guy there besides the engineer, and he was sitting there and he had a long black beard and black mustache and long hair, wearing a peasant shirt. And I sort of looked at him and I just thought he was a friend of Dan's because he sort of initially just watched us as we started the demo. Then he started to intrude a lot on the demo, and he started sort of producing, quote unquote, the demo. And I was like, it was sort of like two roosters in a pen. It wasn't really fun. And I was thinking to myself, what's going on here? Who's this guy? And it turned out that Dan had not told Matt McCauley, who that's the guy, and hadn't told me that we were both producing the demo. So, so it was a creative blind date that Danny had decided was going to be perfect because he felt Matt and I really would complement each other. And he had gone to school with Matt, and Matt was a musical genius. And Dan had the same sort of respect for me at that young age. And we wound up, after that session, we had a dinner that night, and I just fell in love with Matt. I just said, you know what? This is really kismet. And we both felt like we had found our sort of heterosexual soulmate and creative soulmate. So then what happened was that Matt's parents decided to finance an album on Dan. And that album became Dan's first album in 74 called Dan Hill, which Matt and I produced. And then that became a gold record in Canada. We had some hits. We had a release in the US, which didn't do anything. Then the second album was an album called Hold On by Dan. Again, went gold in Canada and had terrific results, but no results in the US. On the third album, we were told by the record label in the US that they were going to drop us if we didn't have a hit. But that's how I started producing, and then I can talk about the story behind Sometimes When We Touch, which became our iconic hit.
Yeah, your first hit, which is your biggest hit. The chapter really breaks down the recording of the song and all these parts that you put together to come up with the song. But there's one I wanted to focus on, and that's the vocals, particularly at the end of the song, that last line in the song.
Well, first of all, we were kids. We really were. I mean, I was 23, Danny and Matt were 22. And we were very precocious kids, and we had already had success in Canada, so we were feeling pretty good. And then we were very deflated when the U.S. company said, we're going to drop you if you don't have a U.S. hit. So the pressure was terrible. I'm not going to get into the story of how the song got written, but that's a good story and part of the book. But you're asking about how the record was made, and it was made under tremendous pressure. And being so young, I think there was a good part of us that were like so full of ourselves that we didn't feel the pressure. But Danny felt the pressure as the artist. Don't forget, as a producer, you're really a behind-the-scenes person. So you don't really take the slings and arrows. But as the artist, your face is on the cover and it's really you. So I think Danny was extremely pressured. And when it came to doing vocals, and he was, again, a very naturally gifted singer. But when it came to doing vocals on Sometimes When We Touch, which we knew, by the way, we just knew in our hearts that it was going to be a smash hit because it was that good a song and it was our big shot, So the pressure was definitely on, and we did the track, and the track was terrific. And then Matt had written the string chart, but we didn't do the strings yet. So we went and did Dan's vocal recording afterwards. And I'm not going to give away a lot that's in the book, but basically Dan really had a hard time doing vocals on that song. He just didn't really seem to have his normal phrasing and sound and pitch. And, we just wound up recording 6 different vocal tracks. And then we wound up having to comp, meaning create a composite. And those days, see, now we do it on computer. It's easy to put the thing together. But in those days, it was faders on the console. And it took 2 days to put the vocal together. And it was me and Matt and Dan, because Dan was very involved in everything. But it was me sort of and Matt, and we would do, you ask me, stop tape, and I would do faders, and you ask me, and I'd stop tape. I'd say, how was that? And if it was impossible to hear the move, we'd move on. So there were 96 vocal moves on that record. Now, Danny gave us great moments and great words and great little phrases, but it took all of our talents to put that vocal together. And then Matt did a glorious string arrangement and we mixed it. Now, if you're a fan of that record, and apparently it's considered one of the 200 most played records in the history of radio, etc. So I guess everyone knows the record. And if you love the record, you remember that the last note, which is "Till the fear in me subsides." And he goes, "Till the fear in me subsides." And we always wanted Dan to hold the note long at the end and let it be sort of the big climax. So, "Till the fear in me subside," and hold that note. And then when we got to the mix, which was a 4-person mix, we're all holding different parts of the board and doing different things in the mix because there was no automation. It was a very performance-oriented world of making records. And I was handling the vocal and I was handling a couple of drum fills. Matt was doing the strings, Danny was doing other stuff, and my engineer was doing other stuff. So all during every mix pass, we'd all be doing our moves. Once we got into the final versions of the mix, it was very clear to us that we didn't have that big climactic last note. As a matter of fact, Danny held it for about 2.5 seconds, and then his voice cracked a little bit. So the best one we had was about subside, a little tear in his throat. And it wasn't a tear that would make you feel great. It was a tear that was a mistake. So here we are again, this sort of Damocles is hanging over our heads, and it was me, I take credit, because I was handling the vocal as well as drum fills in the mix. And I just, out of nowhere, and again, we're talking, this is necessary. So, this is the mother of invention, is necessity. And so I said, let me try something. And I went to the board as I was sitting there, and I grabbed the vocal reverb that I was dealing with on Danny's vocal track. And when we got to that last note, subsides, the minute I know he was going to crack during the mix, I jammed the sound of his voice with as much reverb as possible, but at the same time, I pulled down the fader really fast. And the percussiveness of me pulling down the fader amplified the reverb. So it was subside, and all of a sudden, the voice went into incredible amounts of echo and reverb. And it was sort of interesting. And we all looked at each other because we were sunk because we didn't really have that last note. And we all looked at each other, Dan, me, Andy, and Matt, and we all looked at each other, and it was like, that was interesting. Let's listen back to that, And then we realized that's the only way out was to do what I did. And it was completely just an improvisational moment where I wanted to try this. And to this day, literally people will, when we talk about the record, we'll say, how did you and why did you do that last note?
Right.
And you know what? It was just a lucky break.
What a story. And I was looking, as you were telling the story, Spotify, 84, coming up on 85 million streams. That's not bad.
I wouldn't imagine. I mean, that's only Spotify. So if you look at the rest, it's probably like 250 million.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Your Honor, I'd like to ask for a recess.
The chapter finishes with a cautionary tale. There were royalties that you never received. What happened?
Well, I'm glad you read the book because you're bringing up good stuff, and at the same time, it's no longer traumatic.
Yeah.
Although traumatic was definitely a word I would have used.
Yeah.
We had a huge hit, and so therefore there should have been huge money coming in for all of us. Danny and Barry Mann, who co-wrote the song, and the publisher, as writers and publisher, made money from the actual airplay on the radio, etc. Record producers and artists don't make money from radio play. So our money came from the record label as mechanical royalties. And this was the first time ever that Matt and I were going to see this kind of big money coming in as producers, and Dan as an artist. When the money started to come in, which would have been about a year later, so the record was a big hit, 77 into 78, and I think the first money was coming in around July of 78. And we were already had moved to Los Angeles and were working for Clive Davis. And I remember getting a phone call, and Matt and I both got the phone call while we were making a record in LA. And the phone call was, have someone go to GRT Records in Canada, which was our label in Canada, who would license the project, and we did, to 20th Century Fox Records in the US. And they said, have someone get there right away and get your money because we heard they're going bankrupt. And, again, I'm just a kid. I don't even know what bankrupt really meant, And Matt called his parents, who owned the masters and had leased them to GRT initially. And they sent someone over to the offices of GRT to try to see if they could write a check to us before they, in fact, went officially bankrupt. By the time they got there, the door was padlocked. And they went into full bankruptcy. And all the money that should have gone to us, especially in the big years, when our album Longer Fuse and that single were making its biggest money, was eaten up by the bankruptcy. We never saw a cent. I had married my gal, had moved her from Toronto to LA. We had bought a home. We were furnishing our home. And basically, I was spending my money before I made it, apparently. It just taught me a hell of a lesson, which, of course, is don't spend your money till you got it.
There was some advice that you gave Danny Aykroyd back in 1975. Great story that you include in the book. I love this one.
You want to hear that story?
I would love to.
Many things that I did in the early part of my career, especially the early years in Toronto, was basically any opportunity creatively that was offered to me, I would grab. And that's always been my life. It's like someone says, do you want to try this? And I'd say, sure, I'll try it. And my brother and two other guys had, out of the underground theater scene in Toronto, decided to try and create their own improvisational comedy group. And they enlisted me as the musical fourth person. So I would do the music for the improv shows that they would do. It was a wonderful time in my life. We just laughed like hyenas and we had a ball. And then we also, I was also producing records and I was playing a few gigs still. And I felt pretty good about myself in those days. I felt like I was really sort of hitting on all cylinders. At the same time that we started Homemade Theater, which was our improvisational comedy group, we were doing a TV series for children on CBC, which was like the BBC. We did almost a Monty Python weekly show on CBC, and we loved it. It was a Monty Python for kids. And at the same time, Danny Aykroyd and other people on the Second City improvisational Toronto group were doing another CBC show for kids. And I had met Dan and a few other of the Second City people like Gilda and Joe Flaherty. We had all just become great pals. And even though we were sort of competitors, because we were the only two improvisational comedy groups in Toronto, we just loved each other. So we had a lot of fun together. And Danny especially was so gifted. I always thought he was absolutely a genius, a comedy genius. And sure is true. When we were doing Homemade TV, we were very much in charge of that show. And it was a very funny show for young kids. And probably on many levels, we never should have been allowed to do it because we were really not particularly aware of what not to do when you're dealing with a young adult or young children scenario. So I would say that we were inappropriate, but I would say we were delightfully inappropriate. But they were doing another show called Coming Up Rosie. And it was a very low budget CBC afternoon show once a week. And it really played down to children. It was a scripted show. It sucked. It just sucked. And it was just basically a way for Danny and people like that to make money because that's what we all needed to do was make a living. But that wasn't where Danny belonged. But he was just doing it like a gig. And unfortunately, that show, like I said, sucked. So I was in a place that we used to have our breakfast called The Bagel on College Street. And again, by this time, we'd had hit records in Canada. We were doing pretty well. Danny was struggling. He was doing Second City, but not making a lot of money. And also doing Coming Up Rosie, which, as I told you, was not the greatest little kid show. As I'm walking in, he's walking out. And he always called me Mr. Mollin. He always said, Mr. Mollin. And I said, yeah, hey, Dan, how are you? shot the crap for a while, and then we just, he just told me what's going on. He says, I really got something that's really, really driving me crazy. And I said, what? And this all happened as we were standing outside the Bagel. And he said to me, I've been offered to be a part of the Lorne Michaels show in New York, which is going to start, and it's going to be a live late night show on Saturday nights in New York. And Lorne Michaels, by the way, was a Toronto hero who then moved to New York and became the creator of Saturday Night Live. And so Lorne looked for the original talent base everywhere, including Toronto. And he wanted to hire Dan as a writer at first. And then perhaps he might be able to go in front of the camera. That was the deal. But Dan told me all about it, and it sounded great. And then I said, man, this sounds amazing. You get to go to New York and try this on NBC. This is huge. And he said, yeah. He said, but the contract is so bad. And I said, well, how bad? And he said, well, it's so bad. The money's bad, and they locked me up for 5 years. I can't do anything else for 5 years. And the money stays the same for 5 years. There's no guarantees that I'll be on camera. I mean, you name it, it was a bad contract. And I looked at him because already I was sort of a veteran of show business for like 3 years of my life. I had become a veteran, which is hysterical. And I just looked at him and I said, take the gig. I said, you have an opportunity to get moved to the US and be able to work on a network show on NBC. And I said, listen, if this thing works, your lawyer can renegotiate the deal because they're not going to want to lose you. And if it doesn't work, the contract's over and you come back to Toronto. And he was like, yeah. And you could tell it just lit a light bulb in his head. And by no means am I telling you I'm the only person who gave him that advice, but I certainly was one person.
Sure. And here we are 50 years later, and Saturday Night Live is still going.
Still on the air. And again, and look at the brilliance that Danny was, that he created.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
During our brief intermission, let's take a flying trip from the land of fantasy to everyday life.
You yourself have a sense of humor, like Danny Aykroyd. You played a prank on Rod Stewart. I had Joel Selvin on this podcast, and I'm going to tell you he was one of my all-time favorite guests. I mean, and he has a great line that he tells you. So I'm hoping maybe you could also add that to the to the end of this story.
Do you really want me to tell you this
story?
I
love this story.
This is a whole chapter, man.
I know. I don't want to give away too much. You tell me. I always sometimes guess will say.
I'm not going to give you the whole chapter, but
right.
Joel's gal was my editor, and Pamela Turley is terrific. She wound up she didn't really edit, but she organized everything, especially the timelines, and that was a great help. And she also told me to get rid of 2 chapters. And one was a chapter about all the pranks we would pull during the early years of producing, because we had so much spare time. These records would take sometimes 2 months to make. And, we were just kids, and we would have a lot of fun pranking each other. This chapter, she said, if you put this chapter in, she said, people will hate you. So I opted not to put it in. And then there was another chapter as well. But the one chapter I kept in because Joel Selvin, who I consider a mentor and a dear pal, he said to me, you must keep this chapter in because it involved Rod Stewart. And he said, when you have a chance to prank Rod Stewart, he said, basically, isn't it your duty, he said, to prank Rod Stewart?
Yes.
And Rod was really at his absolute peak at that point. He'd had a lot of success, and he was recording an album in Toronto at the same studio that Matt and I worked at, which we felt we sort of were like the kingpins of. And he took over the big studio for about a month, and he was going to record the album, which turned out to be Tonight's the Night, which was a huge record, which had his biggest hits, I think. For him to record in Toronto was a big deal. He was there because he had some tax problems in England, and he was fleeing from those. We never said hello to him the whole time. And, we would have lots of opportunities to pass him in the hall or whatever. But he was really never particularly interested in people like us, because I guess we were sort of below him or something. And, that sort of got the punk in me and Matt it sort of instilled a bit of a chip on our shoulder, because we were pushed out of the big room, which we didn't want to be because we were busy and we had to work in the smaller room. And secondly, we certainly had a lot of respect for Rod Stewart, and we would have hoped that he would have been, at least somewhat nice to us or interested in us, and he just wasn't. And my partner Matt and I were partners in producing records till 81, when Matt made some changes in his life and didn't want to produce anymore. But at that point, we were still a partnership, and a lovable, delightful partnership, except when, we felt a little pissed off. So Matt became sort of the architect of this particular prank. And it was really, I mean, Matt's brilliant. So it was a brilliant bit of pranking.
Yes,
And
it is.
I don't know, do you want to hear the whole thing?
Well, it's up to you. Yeah, I mean, I just
Well, first of all, I mean,
pranksters should take
can I
notes.
curse on this show?
Oh,
Can I
you
talk
sure
about
can. Yeah, you sure
Okay.
can. I'd
Well,
say pranksters out there, take
this-
notes on this one, because this is
Well, this was a fucked up prank because it took a lot of like Matt was really at his best when he let his dark side out.
and this was really well planned out, well executed.
It was like almost military. It was
Yeah.
so beautifully done. He decided, now Manta only had one bathroom for guys, one bathroom for girls. And in the bathroom for guys, there was a urinal and there was a toilet. We sat a lot in the hallway section, sort of like a little round table. And anybody who'd have to go to the bathroom would have to pass that little round table where we all would sit. And Matt decided to go to Main Street, which is Yonge Street in Toronto. And he went and bought fake dog shit at a magic store. And he also bought some Nestea, instant Nestea. He was already there. Like, he already had it in his mind. And so what he did was he constructed basically what looked like in the men's toilet that someone had a terrible situation. And with the actual, fake dog shit, which he meticulously stained with wet Nestea and toilet paper. I mean, it looked horrible.
And the
There was
water.
a puddle there.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody would want to have gone to the bathroom in that bathroom, and there were no other bathrooms.
Right.
And so, it was really Matt, and it was really, like, he really put some effort and a lot of planning into this. And when he finished, and he said, check it out, I went to the bathroom and looked, and it was just as disgusting as you could ever imagine. And it was all completely constructed by Matt. And then we put a sign on the toilet that said "toilet out of order." And I feel so bad telling the story because I have nothing against Rod Stewart. I think Rod Stewart is actually one of the greatest artists that is still continuing to this day.
I was about to say that I'm a huge Rod Stewart fan, so this is
Yeah,
this is funny. You could have done this to anybody. It's not just because it's Rod Stewart. It's just
I think that when I told Joel Selvin about the story, he just said, "Oh, perfect, how perfect," But the bottom line is, he wasn't very nice to us.
Yeah.
And so that's probably why we did this. And again, Matt really was the person who constructed it.
Yeah.
And
eventually Rod had to go, and
yes, I was going to say, so then we sort of made our we planned to just sit literally in the sort of common area, which was the hall and the little where the round table was and the couches, so we could watch him leave the studio and head to the bathroom. And it took a while, and eventually he made his bathroom run, and he went down the hall, and we're all sitting there going, "Oh my God, this is great." And it didn't last more than 2 seconds, and he was out of there, and you could tell he was steaming angry, and he walked back into the control room of the big studio, and the next day they pulled out of the studio. They
Gone.
left the studio. and my dear friend Andy Herman, who owned the studio and was our engineer, somehow he forgave us, but we didn't expect that.
Oh my
We
God.
expected actually someone to laugh about it, but he
Right.
actually pulled out of the studio.
Oh my God.
To this day, I can, if you're listening, I'm sorry.
Yeah, because now you're the one. You're the son of a bitch who did that. What was the Joel Selvin line that he had for you too? It's at
Gee, I don't remember it exactly,
I
but
gotta
he
look it up.
I think he said, "Isn't it everybody's duty to prank Rod Stewart?"
yeah, that's it. Joel, by the way, his book on Jim Gordon was just absolutely phenomenal.
I agree.
Drums and Demons, yeah.
Drums and Demon, and we had a chance to work with Jim once. Yeah.
Oh, really? Wow. What a drummer.
What a drummer.
What a drummer, and just a tragic story. Yeah.
Yes, a drummer who had real mental illness and paranoid schizophrenia that no one knew, and nothing like drugs and paranoid schizophrenia to make you want to murder your mother.
What song or songs did you work on with him?
I brought him up. Purposely, I reached out because I'm a drummer initially, and so I was a big fan of Jim's playing. And when we were in our fourth album for Dan, the album after Sometimes Sweet Touch album, I really wanted to bring in some other drummers, and certainly Jim Gordon was on the top of my list from LA. So he came into Toronto and he played one day of sessions with us, and he played just great stuff, which is on the fourth Dan Hill album. My memories of Jim were that he was brilliant and that he didn't really hang with us. He didn't have much to say, but he seemed lovely, but wasn't really like one of the guys. And after 2 days, he went home, and we have gorgeous drum tracks. Sadly, shortly after, he hammered his mother to death.
Yeah, man. He was on so many recordings, but most famously for Derek and the Dominoes, Layla,
Yes.
and all that. But anyway, so yeah.
Honestly, out of the list of the top 10 studio drummers, he would be at least on the top 3 of all time.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this.
I swear I'll make it up to you.
Talk about the dark side with drugs, and Harry Nilsson was a story in the book. He wasn't all that nice to you.
First of all, you really know your stuff. This is really a delight.
Thank
to
you.
talk with you.
I enjoyed the book. I told you, there's so many stories in it.
Thank you.
I always
so
feel
much.
bad because I don't want to reveal too many, but there's way more than we're going to cover here. So
you're giving away the good ones. There's only 2 chapters or sections in the book where I do bring up some pretty bad stuff. The Harry Nilsson thing is one of the stories, and when Jimmy Webb was doing an album with us in 1978, which was a great thrill for Matt and I, we had just moved to Los Angeles, and to produce Jimmy Webb was my dream. And so to produce that record was so important to my life, and I've been working with Jimmy ever since. It was a dream to make that first record, of course. And again, we're just kids. And I remember at one point, we were at Larrabee Studios doing vocals with Jimmy. And listen, you know what? Those were days when we all were doing things we shouldn't have done because they were good for us. Like cocaine was good for you then. The one thing I remember, though, was for Jimmy's vocals, we wouldn't want to do coke those days because it would stuff his nose up and fuck his vocals up. So we were pretty good to not do coke those days, even a little bit. And I remember that Harry Nilsson, who of course I didn't, Harry Nilsson's a giant, literally. I mean, he was already considered a legend. And he walked into the studio, and I didn't know who it was because it was a guy who was literally 3 times the size of the person I thought Harry Nilsson would be. So he looked like Baby Huey, and he was disheveled and very loud. And he walked into the control room, and we introduced ourselves. And he didn't even let us introduce ourselves. He said, "Move away." And he got to the console, and he went on the talk back because Jimmy's out there doing vocals. And he goes, "Hey, Jimmy." And he's obviously drunk and stoned. And he goes, "Jimmy." And it's daytime. He goes, "Jimmy, I got the best fucking cocaine. You got to come in." Now, again, we're kids. And I'm like, "Harry, why don't we wait till his vocals are done?" And Harry goes, "Fuck you." And he pours a ton of cocaine on the console, spills it on the console, and he puts his big fat head on the console and snorts it like a monster off the console. Jimmy comes in, they love each other, give big hugs to each other, and then Jimmy starts doing cocaine and the session is over because Jimmy can't sing once he's all stuffed up. And it turned out that Harry was very angry that young people were producing his buddy Jimmy. Like we did not have the right to produce him. And you know what? We were very precocious kids, but we were really good. Like Matthew and I made an incredible team, and we knew what we were doing, and we were doing a wonderful record for Jim, and Jim loved us. Harry didn't. So that was a bad experience. If it ended there, it would be fine, but it didn't end there. And so you want me to finish the story? I said,
yeah, you saw him again, right? You ran into him at a party.
So then a few weeks later, Jimmy had a party at his house in Encino, and my wife and I attended, and we had a ball, incredible array of people, and it was a lovely night. And Harry was there, and I tried to keep away from him. And again, he was like the Goodyear blimp. He was a big, fat, slobby version of himself, but I kept away from him. But in the middle of the party, he came up to me, and he said, "Fred, And I said, yeah. He goes, oh, it's good to see you, man. And he was really nice to me. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this is great. He's accepting me, you know. And I said, oh, great. So nice to see you, Harry. And he said, come with me. And so we went to the other living room. And he said, you got to try this shit. And I'm like thinking it's cocaine, going, I'm there. Harry Nilsson's going to share some cocaine with me. He cupped his hand. So I put my nose into the cup and I snorted. And the next thing I remember was I was on my back and my wife Dina was sobbing over me. And I sort of came to. And it turned out that what he gave me was amyl nitrate, which is stuff that is supposed to start your heart. You know, so it's a medical, I mean, it's used recreationally, but it really is for people who need to start their heart. And I had snorted that enthusiastically, thinking it was cocaine, and I blacked out apparently. And apparently, Dina said to me that when I blacked out, I dropped, and I missed a very classic antique hard table. My head missed it by this much. So I
Wow.
literally could have been killed or had brain damage or whatever. And when I woke up and I came to, I was lying on my back with Dina crying and Harry's leaning over me, laughing and going, it was amyl nitrate, man. Fuck you. And he went away. So the Harry Nilsson that I knew was a devil. I mean, he was a monster.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. I get his reputation prior to that was he was a great guy, nice guy. Everybody got along with him great.
And, I want to tell you, everyone got along with him great as long as they stayed as drunk and stoned as he was.
Right. Jesus. Yeah. And that always begs the question is like, is that bringing out who you really are, or are drugs and alcohol?
Well, I did watch the documentary, which I thought was really good.
I did see that
Came out.
too. Yeah.
Yeah, years ago I watched it, and he really had such a terribly sad background and childhood, and I mean, he just was a tortured guy.
Yeah.
But again, that doesn't mean you try to kill me. Thanks.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Grammy-nominated Juno Award-winning producer and composer Fred Mollin is our guest. His book, Unplugged Stories and Secrets from a Life of Making Records, Scoring Film, and Working with the Legends of Music. And you sure have, including Michael McDonald. There's a photo in the book of him from 78 with you at Sunset Sound in Hollywood, which is where many of you can see the Van Halen banner behind me. Many of the great Van Halen records were recorded. What's it like? Yeah, what's it like working with Michael McDonald?
Well, Michael, we reached out to Michael. See, I'm a fan of music, and I'm a musicologist without knowing it. But when the first Doobies album came out that had Michael on it, I had gotten it early on, and I listened to that guy, and I said, "What a voice! Like, this is the coolest stuff ever." And I had known Michael's name because he'd sang on Steely Dan's Katie Lied album, which I was also gung-ho over. So I listened to a lot of music, and I took note of these kinds of things. And I said, man, the drummer on Katie Lied was Jeff Porcaro. I got to work with him one day. And the vocalist who sang all the backgrounds was Michael McDonald. And then he joined the Doobies, and I'm in Toronto, and I called him at Amigo Studios because I knew they were recording there. And I called him from Toronto, and I said, hey, I'm Fred Mollin. I told him who I was, and I said, listen, we're going to do some recording in LA on an artist named Randy Goodrum for Clive Davis's label. Would you consider singing backgrounds for us? And he was like, yeah, no problem, man. Of course I'll do it. And I was like, this is great. So Matt and I flew to LA, and we did 3 days of background vocals and overdubs on this project. And Michael and Leah Kunkel, who just passed away, sadly, but Michael sang backgrounds for us on 3 songs for Randy, and they were superb and just lifted the recordings up so much. But more importantly, we were about the same age, and we just got along like a house on fire. So, I've known Michael forever, and we've worked together on so many different things, and we're such great pals. And I love his wife. I've produced his wife, Amy McDonald, who goes under the name of Amy Holland. They're just the most dear people, and they're extended family, but it started with that. Yeah.
Wow. So is he like, his voice is so great. Is he like a one-take guy? Do you even have to?
He certainly can.
You're good.
Yeah. I mean, when you have somebody that gifted and you have the opportunity to try a few more passes, you do it.
Yeah. And he's got a great sense of humor. He seems very humble. The Captain Kangaroo story, right?
Oh my God. He's so self-deprecating.
Yeah.
It's hysterical.
Somebody at the airport. Oh, I know you. And they went to their husband or wife and said, hey, that's Captain Kangaroo. Because he had gained a few pounds, I think, at the time.
Yeah, I mean,
so.
Michael's weight would fluctuate. And with the big white mustache and beard, Michael said to me, Fred, listen, it wasn't 2 months ago I was going through the airport and someone said, hey, you know what that is? And the other girl said, yeah, Santa Claus. So he'd make fun of himself, and he still does. He has the most self-deprecating sense of humor. Yeah.
And if you want to, next time you talk to him, because I have a few friends, women who are just still in love with him, so you could tell them that. They are in love with Michael McDonald.
In my lifetime, I don't think there's anyone more soulful and more brilliant.
Oh man,
than Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. You worked with Ronnie Hawkins in 1981. A hysterical one-man wrecking crew is how you described him. He's got Bo Diddley stories that he.
Oh my God! All we did with Ronnie's album, when I moved back to Toronto, my wife and I, after 3 years in LA, had enough. From 78 to 81. At that point, I was no longer working with Matt, so I was on my own as a producer. And we wanted to have kids, and I missed Toronto, and we said, let's go back to Toronto and have kids there. And hopefully when I got back to Toronto, I figured I'd be a hometown hero and be really busy. And frankly, it never happened. It was sort of like, oh, we sort of remember you. But I did get one project the minute I got back to Toronto in 81, which was producing Ronnie Hawkins, whose most famous place in history is, he was a 50s rocker who moved to Canada and became sort of the mayor of Yonge Street in Toronto and had this lovely career and became a Canadian icon, but never really had hit records, but he was just a great entertainer. But his background of his history that people will always talk about is one of his last bands that he put together in the 60s turned out to be the band. So Lee Von Helm, Garth, Robbie Robertson, Rick Danko, and Richard Manuel. They were all Hawks. Basically, it was Ronnie who discovered those guys and turned them into a band, which then became the band. So for that alone, Ronnie should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He's certainly in the Canadian Hall of Fame. But making that record in 81, after I'd returned to Toronto, was absolutely, literally, I had never laughed so hard in a studio all day long in my life. He was like Andrew Dice Clay. It was just like one disgusting story after the next, one disgusting aside after the next. And all we did was laugh, and we made a great record. I won him a Juno Award. I gave him a hit record in Canada, and always loved him. He's gone now, but we really had a wonderful time making that record, and his stories were absolutely disgusting. Yeah.
I cannot believe that all the members of the band are no longer with us now.
That's right. They're all gone now. Garth was the last one.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
All his life as he looked away to the future, to the horizon, never his mind on where he was.
Any piece of advice, what would be the first thing you tell if somebody's a young person right now listening to this, they want to get into producing music, rock and roll music, pop music, whatever. What's your piece of advice that you would give them?
I produced and started my career back in the day, and it's no longer what it was then. So I just want people to know if they really can't do anything else, if literally they're so driven that they have a calling, and that calling is to direct music in the studio, meaning being a record producer. And if that's their dream and they want to pursue it and they have no other choice, that's the only advice I give you, is to go for it. But let me tell you that it's way tougher now. It is absolutely, your chances of having success are so slim. And even if you have great records that you make, only 1% of all new music sells. So, that's a different world. I don't know, and this is a chilling thing to say, but I don't know if I would have pursued my career if I had started now.
Yeah, because the business model now is drastically different than it was.
There's no comparison. It's literally has no relation to what I started with.
How do record labels survive?
Well, record labels do great, because what's happening now is that the major labels and the smaller labels make all their money from their back catalog, which is streamed. So they make a fortune without having to do anything. So they don't even have to manufacture product anymore. So they no longer need marketing of those records. They don't need distribution of those records. They're just available on streaming, and they just collect.
So they
So
still
it is,
make money, but
yeah. So I'm saying, but everyone makes money, but the record labels make the most. And so literally, record labels now no longer have to sign new artists if they don't want, and most of the time they don't want to, and they don't have to have product manufactured. They just put it out there and it's streamed. And so again, we're looking at a whole nother world now. There, in
but
the old days, we really had a shot. I don't think I would ever have had a shot now.
because that led to job cuts, and that leads to now where it's probably difficult to get a job
Well,
at a record label because they don't need
there's
you.
no longer,
Yeah.
half the reason that you'd have people working at a record label were because there was actual product being manufactured and having to be marketed, and they'd be signing all sorts of new acts. None of that happens. I mean, literally, these labels are making a fortune off of all the iconic artists that they have that are streamed, 100 million, 200 million times a day. And so they make great money and they don't have to do anything.
Speaking of finances, when your movie career takes off, at that point you're really in need of money, and all of a sudden you have more work than you can keep up. At one point, so mid '80s, right? This is when you have a child, and suddenly film work comes along.
Yeah, we had moved back from LA. I was trying to continue my life as a record producer in Toronto and didn't have a lot of success, did a few projects, but it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't a homecoming hero scenario. And again, this is a part of my life. Someone calls up and says, "Do you want to try this?" And I'll say, "Yeah, I'll try that." And that was scoring a TV movie. And then it became someone called and wanted me to score a big movie in the sense that it was going to be distributed, with a lot of theaters and it was an actual feature. And I did that. And so all of a sudden, I just made this left turn without really wanting to, but it was paying me and it was musical. And so I became a TV and film composer from around 85. My son was born in 84. And by 85, I was sort of making a living no longer really in records. And again, don't forget the Dan Hill money, had not been coming in and still didn't come in. So my biggest hit was not bringing me any royalties. So yeah, it was a little bit tough. And all of a sudden projects came in that were challenging for me. I was interested in the challenge. And I had no interest whatsoever previously of being a film and TV composer, but I started to become one and I fell into it and I sort of liked the challenge and I liked the money. The money was good. And then by 87, I was full time and really making great money, both on the back end through my airplay royalties as well as from my fees.
So I'm fascinated with the process of this. Are you given the film to watch as is without music and come up with the music based on what you're seeing? Are they giving you direction? Are they saying this is what we're looking for?
Well, I mean, again, I did a lot of TV series work, dramatic TV series. So once you start a series, you're working with a team of people. And once you've already created a sonic and musical landscape that they like, there's really no time for them to oversee you. You do your work and deliver it. So, on all the TV series I did, especially the ones that were long running, once the thing got going, everyone trusted each other and everyone did their job and delivered it. And as long as you didn't drop the ball and not deliver it on time, they loved you. And it was a lot of teamwork and camaraderie in that regard. And as far as, if I was doing a one-off project like a movie, I'd sneak in a movie occasionally or TV movie. Then there's a little more involvement because you're working a little closer with the director. On TV series, by the time you get to the show in post-production, that director's gone and they're doing the next show. So, so I didn't really have a lot to do, but when I did work in other movies, then yes, you would work very closely with the director. You'd audition music for him, which is what we did the first episode of each series. But once they signed off on what you did, it was like, man, we're busy. Just keep going.
You did 90210,
I did one season.
one season. I'm a huge Friday the 13th fan. So you're in part 7 and 8, but prior to the movies, you did the TV series, and then that led to the two films?
I was hired. It was shot in Toronto, Friday the 13th, the series. And Frank Mancuso Jr. was the person at Paramount who really oversaw all of the Friday the 13th franchise. So after doing, I think, maybe 40 episodes of that series, they did part 7 with the original composer, Harry Manfredini, using his previously recorded score. And so on part 7, they couldn't finish it. And they called me and said, "Hey, can you write music similar to Harry in its sound and then, in a sense, co-score it with the music we have from Harry. And I said, of course, again, I don't turn down gigs, so I just said, yeah, of course I'll do it. And then that moved on. They did part 8, which was Jason Takes Manhattan. And that one I worked with a guy named Rob Hedden, who I'd worked with on the TV series. And I love Rob. And he wanted to work with me as the full composer on that movie. And that was really great fun as well, to work with Rob. And again, because it was a movie, you work a little closer with the director, at least initially. But that's how the movies came about, is I had already become I did 72 episodes of Friday the 13th, the series. So I was the composer that they felt would understand how to work with them.
Writing for horror, how is that for you? I mean,
Again, I'm just like one of these guys where someone says, hey, do you want to do an accordion album with, a guy who only screams? I'll say, sure.
It's a gig. Yeah.
A gig is a gig is a gig.
Yeah.
And I've never been in that position where I really don't. I mean, the only time I turn down gigs is when I don't like the person and I can tell already that I won't get along with them.
Okay.
That's only happened like 3 times in my entire career.
So other than that, you're able to shift gears, whatever the
It's
genre.
whatever they asked for. Listen, on occasion, someone would have called and said, we need you to orchestrate like John Williams, and we need you to, and I'd say, well, I can hire an orchestrator and I can do that. And most times they would say, okay, great, but occasionally someone would say, no, we really want someone who's within the budget, can orchestrate everything and work with a large orchestra. Well, that's not me. I was doing a lot of my music using Kurzweil 250 and other synthesizers and samplers, and I would be playing everything and improvising my music until it was right for the scene. So that was the kind of composer and TV film guy that I was.
So 1987 was a huge year for you. That's your favorite year.
87 was a watershed year because I don't think I've ever been busier. I was doing 3 series at once. One of them took me to LA every 2 weeks. I was co-starring in a rock and roll variety show in Toronto on CBC. And my daughter was born. I mean, it was just the craziest, wildest, most beautiful year. Yeah.
That's what I want to ask you, because sometimes I think we all do, but I've gotten to points recently where I do have a lot of offers that come my way, and I don't say no. And I spread myself so thin, I'm starting to crack, and I can't keep up. How do you handle that? Do you say no? I mean, what do you do?
I don't know. By the grace of God or dog or whatever, I just was lucky enough or hardworking enough that I just was able to keep going.
Somehow find a way to do it.
But I'll tell you, the honest truth is that in 2001, I moved to Nashville and changed my life. And I wanted to go back to making records full time with live musicians. And I said, I'll never score another TV series again. And I never did.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
We're going to take a break and be back.
So maybe a comment or two on some of these folks that you work with too, because there's so many. But Bruce Springsteen.
I think Bruce Springsteen is one of the greatest entertainers and artists of our time. I think he's a giant. There's probably nobody better live performer, in my opinion, than Bruce Springsteen. And as far as the records he's made, they're giant. So he is one of my absolute favorites, has been since, the 70s. I've never worked with him, but I worked with his wife on a Rita Wilson overdub duet. And I got to spend time with Bruce at his studio in New Jersey. And he was lovable. He was great.
Just after Clarence passed, too, I think you know.
Exactly, yeah. He was still very much in mourning over Clarence.
Yeah, Paul Schaefer.
Paul and I, when I first moved to Toronto, we played in Tony Kosanek's backing group. And Paul was on keyboard. He was fresh from Thunder Bay, Ontario. I was fresh from Long Island. And we wound up in Toronto around the same time. He's a little older than me. And we just became fast friends and are to this day, yeah.
Danny Korchmar. Some listening may not know who Danny Korchmar is. They've heard him play on songs. He's so important to rock history.
He really is. I mean, Danny, he's known as Cooch, but I love Danny so much. We became great friends. I had a home in Martha's Vineyard for years and years. Now I just rent, but I had my house there for years, and Danny was a vineyarder as well in the summers growing up there. And Danny is one of those guys they really need to write a book on Danny, or Danny needs to write his book, because he was so pivotal on so many things. Like, he's the guy who grew up with James Taylor on Martha's Vineyard in the summers on Martha's Vineyard. He's the one who bullied James into being a solo artist. There would be no James Taylor without Danny. Same thing with Carole King. He played with Carole King when she started to put her toe in the water as a solo artist at the end of the 60s into the early 70s. And Danny, again, bullied her, saying, you're going to be a solo artist. And to this day, both of those artists say, if it wasn't for Danny, we would not be doing what we do. So he's a really interesting character. He can be a bully, a lovable bully, and he is so delightful on so many levels. We just get along like gangbusters and have been great friends forever. But again, he's someone who's done so many great things as a session player, along with his buddies Russ Kunkel and Lee Sklar and Waddy Wachtel.
They did a documentary on all of them.
Yes,
Did you see
the
it?
documentary called The Immediate Family, which is all about Danny and the band.
And they got their
And
own
you know,
band.
again, I had something to do with that documentary, which is delightful. But Danny's stories, you know, Danny also became a producer. He wound up co-producing Don Henley on his big records, and he also produced Billy Joel's last record that had River of Dreams on it. Dan's so gifted. The difference between Danny and I as producers is Danny has no bedside manner, and he's the first one to tell you.
Yeah.
You know? And I have 100% bedside manner.
Yeah. Jeff Porcaro, drummer from Toto. You said best you've worked with, best drummer?
Never been a better studio drummer than Jeff. Yeah.
And why do you say that? What is it about him?
It was magical. He just had a touch and a feel and a soul and an enthusiasm and a passion combined in one person that we had never seen. And everyone will say the same thing.
Jackson Browne?
Loved working with Jackson. He, you know, I did a couple of duets with him over the years, and we always enjoyed working with each other. I've never gotten to know him well, but we certainly have spent time together, and I'm just such a great fan.
Joe Cocker his vocals had you in tears?
Yeah, I've only gotten to work with a few people once, and Joe was one of those people that we were doing the second of two Jimmy Webb duet albums. And I said to Jimmy, you know, what do you think about bringing Joe Cocker on as a duet? This was 2011, I think. I said, what about Joe doing Moon's a Harsh Mistress with you as a duet? Because Joe had done a definitive version of Jimmy's song, Moon's a Harsh Mistress. And Jimmy loved the idea, and we called Joe, you know, we got a hold of Joe's manager, and then Joe said, of course I'll do this, and we wound up in LA while Joe was recording a solo album. I think this was 2011 maybe, or 2012. It was certainly about 6 or 7 months before he passed. And we just, again, was a delightful guy. And, you know, we did a couple of overdub passes on his parts of the song where he sang his lead in the duet. And we were all just sobbing because it was so emotional, you know. I mean, Joe Cocker is now being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It's taken this long, but he's so deserving. I mean, he was just really such a soulful singer and artist, and what a great thrill it was for me to work with him. It was only that one time, but it was marvelous.
From a producer standpoint, if you had to pick a song or an album that you would say, like, that is it, like the definitive creation, what would it be? Because Pet Sounds comes to mind now. I like that more and more as I get older. Like, it didn't click with me when I was younger.
I mean,
there's
a Beatles
so many.
album. I mean, I think in the top 10, of course, is Sgt. Pepper, Born to Run, Bruce Springsteen. That album shook me up. Pet Sounds, of course, by the Beach Boys is a work of genius. You know, there's too many albums that I love, but those three, you know, yeah, those are top 10, sure.
I mean, Pet Sounds is just so ahead of its time, so nobody really got it at the time.
Wasn't that much of a success initially, no.
Yeah. So finally, because my mother loves Johnny Mathis, you worked with him and Billy Joel, right? That was in 2011.
Sounds right. Well, first of all, I've produced 2 duets with Billy, and I love him. We got along famously. We're both Long Island kids. He's a little bit older than me, but again, we had just a great connection. So I worked on a duet with him and Jimmy Webb for Jimmy on Wichita Lineman. And then when I was doing Johnny's Christmas album, Sending You a Little Christmas, which I think, again, was like 2012, recording it in Nashville, I reached out to Billy and said, would you want to do a duet with Johnny? And he was like, oh, I'm there, you know, and he flew himself in, and he wanted to do it with John, which, you know, a lot of the duets I do are done after the main artist has done their parts, and then we overdub the duet. But Billy wanted to be there for the Day of the Musicians with Johnny live. And we did Chestnuts Roasting on an Open Fire, which is called the Christmas song. And I had positioned who would sing what lines and what verses, etc., what harmonies and so on. And, you know, John, even at 90 right now, still has the same voice that he had when he was 20. It's remarkable. Billy probably didn't know what to expect, but when they started singing together, and Columbia shot all this on video, although I've never seen any of it, but I do remember watching Billy, who was in one isolation booth, but could see Johnny and could hear Johnny, and vice versa. And at one point, the song modulates, and Johnny has to hit some really high notes. And Johnny did it so effortlessly. And Billy just looked at me like he just could not believe what he just heard live.
Yeah.
And it is, by the way, that particular version of the Christmas song with Johnny and Billy, I think should be a Grammy Hall of Fame recording.
My favorite Christmas album, hands down, is the one where Mathis, he's on the skis.
That's the original one.
That's the original one.
It was like him in a photo studio with a winter outfit and skis, but he was sweating to death or something.
My dad played it every Christmas, and I remember transferring it onto cassette, and then I got it on CD, and now it's, of course, you can get it.
Yeah, no, listen, I've produced 2 of Johnny's Christmas albums, but he's done 6.
6 altogether, yeah. Unplugged, stories and secrets from a life of making records, scoring film, and working with the legends of music. The book is out now, right? You can find it wherever.
May 11th.
It's May 11th. Okay, so we're recording this on May the 2nd. So right around the time we run this. So look for it. You can pre-order it if it hasn't come out yet. And where can people find you online? You have a website.
Yes, I don't have a lot of time checking on it, but you can write to me through the website. Also, if you want the book autographed, there's a website now, fredmollinunplugged.com, where you can order the book and it'll get signed by me. So that's available. And I'm still a work in progress. I'm busy working in the studio, and very, very fortunate person. I've had an incredible life in music and never want it to end.
Fred, thank you for doing this, and so many stories. And I promise you, folks, there's much more in this book.
Thank you so much. And I really, really had a ball. Thank you.
That's it. It's in the books.